Thanks very much, and also my thanks to DFID for the great support we received to actually work with some developing countries to scale that in context. The first question is, does education or skills, do skills make a difference? And actually there is an answer to this. One of the things that we recently did is we assessed not children in school, which is PISA, but we actually did the same thing in the adult workforce. We tested the skills of people directly, and then we can see that being at the high end of the skill distribution as opposed to having only the foundation level is a pretty robust predictor of your being in employment. Now you are twice as likely to be employed with high skills than with basic skills. You are 3 times as likely to earn an above median wage. So actually skills and earnings are pretty closely linked. But it doesn't stop with money. You can see a relationship with the health of people, with their propensity to volunteer, with political efficacy. People at the high end of the skill distribution see themselves as actors in a society. People at the low end see themselves as objects. Don't believe they have any influence on this. And even trust, that's the most interesting variable. Now, people say that trust has to do with the people I trust or with the institutions in my country and so on. But in fact, a big part of that trust, levels of trust, you can predict with the skills that you have, not the trust that other people deserve. It's a really interesting kind of mix of social and economic outcomes that are pretty closely linked to skills. And a country like the UK would even see closer links than other countries. I think the capacity of an economy to extract value from human capital varies quite a bit as well. So there's every reason for us to look at skills as a source for economic growth. But I show you sort of the other side of the coin. Look at this. And this was some analysis done by the Hoover Institute at Stanford. Here you can see the world regions ordered by the level of economic development in the 60s and the level of schooling they had got at that time. And you can see that GDP per capita in 1960 mapped almost perfectly to the years of schooling that people had attained. So you look at this and you say, yes, that's always what we said. Put children in school for many years and you're going to get a richer economy. But now you look at what happened between 1960 and the year 2000. This is the growth. And you actually start to order countries on both dimensions, and you can see the years of schooling were actually a pretty bad predictor for the level of economic growth of countries. You can look here at Latin America that did really quite well in terms of years of schooling, number 3, and came out very badly in terms of economic growth. Or you look at Asia, they were at the bottom in terms of years of schooling, but saw the most robust economic growth. Even we in the rich world, we were well educated, but we didn't see that much growth. So there are 2 conclusions you can derive from this. Now, one is maybe education is not so important as we thought. When you look at this, you would think, well, years of education didn't predict growth that well. The other conclusion is maybe years of schooling is just a very bad measure for the human capital of people. How can you test that hypothesis? Well, you measure human capital directly, and that's really what PISA is about. And when you do that, look at this. You can see, not perfectly, but almost perfectly, you can align the level of economic growth with a direct measure of human capital. I could put this even on a chart, and you can see here's the conditional test score, here's conditional growth, and you can see basically world regions lining up on a straight line. So the answer is basically a direct measure of human capital. The skills that you have are actually very closely related to the well-being in your country. The length of schooling is just a very poor predictor of that. Years of schooling is not sort of a guarantee for good educational outcomes. And that's really what motivated us to measure outcomes directly. That's what the PISA program is about. And you can see here the green countries are the ones for which we have comparative data. It's a large part of the world economy, but there are also some very important white spots. In China, there's a lot happening now. I think we're going to fill that gap very quickly. In India, we've started with 2 states now, Himachal Pradesh and Tamil Nadu. Things are getting a bit slower. The Middle East, most countries are working on this. The big white spot really is Africa, where we are just at the very, very beginning. And then whether we get to Greenland one day, I don't know. I think there's actually more and more countries, and it's all voluntary. It's actually really intriguing. Now, this is not an assessment that the OECD can simply roll out. It's countries that have to subscribe and participate in this. And you can see actually most countries really want to measure themselves on a world scale. And you can basically then, just to give you a sort of sense of the methodology, we basically take representative samples of students in each of these countries. And each assessment is made up of about 500,000 students around those countries. They take a test, and one of the things that makes this test different from a traditional school test is that we are less interested in whether students can simply reproduce something they learn in school. We give them tasks whether they have to demonstrate that they can actually extrapolate from what they know, deal with things that they have not seen in school. We think that's very important because, in most parts of the world, the economy no longer pays you for what you know. Google knows everything. The world economy pays you for what you can do with what you know. And this lack of kind of more vocationally oriented skills is actually a big, big bottleneck in many education systems. So many people criticize us for this. They say this PISA test is unfair because you give students the test with tasks that they haven't seen in school before. That sort of, I can understand that, but if you take that line, you should consider life unfair, because the test of truth is not do I remember what my teacher told me, but whether I can actually use that. So there is a reason behind that approach. And then we collect a lot of contextual data to understand those results. And that's actually not a sort of an add-on to PISA, but an integral part of the story. If we do not measure what's happening in classrooms, at the schools, at the education system, we can't interpret the results. So basically we have built a very sort of extensive system of contextual data that we use to explain those kinds of results. Just sort of a couple of results. Now you can basically line up countries on a scale. That's what the media like to do. Now you can basically see the Asian countries usually come out on top. Switzerland, Netherlands, Estonia, Finland in Europe do very well. Canada in North America. Vietnam, amazing success story. And then comes sort of the middle of the pack. That's where you find the UK. And then countries which have fewer, poorer results. And the performance gap that we're talking about here is actually quite large. We're talking here about 7 years of schooling that separate 15-year-olds on that scale. So that is a very, very important kind of performance difference. And the second dimension I want to bring is this equity. We measure also the strengths of the social background, the impact of that on the success of children. In some countries, social background is a big impediment to improvement. In others, outcomes are more equitably distributed. You look at this, everybody wants to be here, but performance is good and social disparities are very narrow. Nobody likes to be there, but performance is poor and there are large disparities. But actually much of the education debate, and I think that's even more so in the developing world, is that people say, well, if you want to do well on average, you have to accept large disparities. Or if you want to focus on equity, you cannot reach sort of more than mediocre results. And that's an interesting paper actually, comparing the growth trajectories in education between Korea and Mexico. In the 1960s, actually, Mexico started out a lot better than Korea. But they had very different strategies. Basically, the Mexicans were here, the Koreans were there, and then they actually grew out of this. Let's see how countries come out of this. And you do see actually that there is as much variation on the equity dimension than on the performance variation. You also see that there's no relationship among the two. There is no trade-off in policy terms between the quality of learning outcomes and equity in the distribution of learning opportunities. You can get both things right, or you can get both things wrong. And the last point I want to make here is actually putting money into these are just some examples, money into the equation. Unfortunately, I don't have data for all of the countries, so I just have a selection. The size of the dot that you're going to see is the spending per student, basically, no? Per year. So the larger the dot, the more money is being spent per student. The smaller the dot, the less expensive the education system. And the first thing that comes to your mind here is that actually money is a very poor predictor of learning outcomes. No? We explain less than 20% of the performance differences with volume of spending. No? Once you drill down and look at the nature of spending, you get a very different story. No? How countries invest their resources explains a lot of the differences here. For example, high-performing countries typically prioritize the quality of teaching over the size of classes. No? If they have a choice, do I decrease my class or improve my teaching, they go for the latter. It's another story, but volume of spending actually doesn't tell you very much. Some people say this is all about culture, and if that would be the case, this world would look like this for centuries, because culture doesn't change very quick. No? But in fact, you can see actually amazing changes here. First thing you can see, for example, if you look at Shanghai, they were here in 2009 and they moved up to the next screen in 2012. No? An education system does well, but continues to improve. No? Singapore is another country moving upwards. But it's not only the top end of the distribution. You look at Turkey here, this is where they are, and this is where they were 10 years before. No? You could actually see how they were able to raise outcomes and also close a lot of the achievement gap. No? Very impressive kind of outcomes. Germany started out here, moved up a bit, but more importantly moved to the right side, basically closing social gaps. Or Italy, very impressive performance gains. So Poland, another success. Portugal, moving a bit to the left, becoming more inequitable, but also raising performance by a large margin. So you can continue that. And you can actually see that there has been a lot of change in education. The biggest improver in this is Brazil, in fact. One of the countries that is still, I can't show you because it's on a lower performance scale, but it's actually the one that has seen the most significant gains in overall performance. So overall, things are moving. And you can see as much improvement at the bottom end as there is at the top end. Does it matter? Again, the Hoover Institute has done some really interesting growth regressions, historical growth regressions, using endogenic growth models, basically looking at, if we raise PISA outcomes, what does it mean in terms of the long-term economic value added to today's 15-year-olds? And they come up with really, really big numbers. These are real billions, so you talk about trillions of dollars that is added by raising everybody to 400 points on the PISA scale. And that is still one full standard deviation below the OECD average. It's a pretty low baseline. But if we would succeed to actually get the poorest performing students up to that level, we would gain, particularly in those countries that perform very low, very, very large numbers in terms of added economic output. You can translate this into a GDP metric, and you talk about several times of the size of economy over the lifetime of those children. So those historical growth regressions show actually very significant impacts. What's interesting is we can now also do this at the micro level. We have longitudinal data for some of the countries only since 2000, so they're just beginning their working life. But even there, you can see that those skill data are highly predictive for income growth at the individual level, and the data are reasonably consistent with those kind of data at the aggregate level. So you can actually say, again, improving the quantity of education is not a very good bet. But if you can raise the actual quality of learning outcomes, you can actually achieve a lot. So what can countries learn from each other? I want to order the kind of things by their relative impact on outcomes. Things that are important, I put on the top. Things that are less important, I put at the bottom. And of course, you need to factor in the political and economic cost of reform always. Everybody wants to do things that are really important and very easy to do. Nobody wants to invest in things that are actually very hard to do and less important. But again, you come to issues like class size and lots of things, and we must concede actually that educational investment hasn't always been very, very smart. And I actually think there are many many lessons that the developing world can learn from our experiences in this quadrant, no? Where not to invest. No? There are some things that are really important, but very hard to do, and then you can pick up some low-hanging fruit, things that are easy to do, not so important. No? I just wanted to highlight a few things that we have really seen consistently across countries coming out of our data. I want to start with something that seems really hard to articulate, but it's this kind of value that economies basically place on education. And you can see this in the mere mindset of students. We asked, one time we asked them a very simple question, what do you believe makes you successful in mathematics? And you would have many children in the UK, even more so in the US, who would tell you, well, it's all a matter of talent. Now, if I'm not born as a genius in mathematics, I better study something else. So basically the education system is just sorting me, whatever I do. You ask that very same question to Chinese students in Shanghai or Japanese, and those kids consistently tell you, if I really try hard, I trust my teacher is going to help me and I'm going to be successful. And that tells a very important story, that basically the education system has instilled this belief in people that they own their learning success. And you can see that in the data that comes out of this. What I'm doing here is I show you the performance of students by decile of social background. No? If you are in the red dot, you come from the poorest families. If you are in the green dot, you come from the 10% richest families. No? And you can see in Mexico, children from poorer families do worse than the children from richer families. No? And there's nothing wrong with the Mexicans. You can see the same thing in Chile. In fact, if you come from a disadvantaged background, you're worse off in Chile than you're in Mexico. If you come from a rich family, you're better off than from a rich family in Mexico. Where this gets really interesting is you can do that across every country with this data now. And look at this. The red students have everywhere in the world the same social background. Right? They come from families which have very little education, very low income, single parent families, and whatsoever the disadvantage factors are. And you can see their performance varies enormously across countries. You can actually link them. You can see the 10% most disadvantaged students in Shanghai. Those are students from immigrant families with, no educational history, parents working as room cleaners. They outperform the children of professionals in the UK and in many other countries now. And this actually gives us an illustration of how much better we could be doing for children from disadvantage. Every country, social disadvantage is a barrier in every country, and no country has escaped that logic. No? I think Liechtenstein maybe, but there are no poor people in Liechtenstein, so that doesn't really... Yeah, there's no red dots. No? But nobody escapes that kind of dynamic. But the extent to which education systems are able to sort of leverage the talent of disadvantaged children varies hugely. And that's a very powerful lesson to the developing world. In fact, GDP explains less than 6% of the PISA results. The world is no longer divided between rich and well-educated and poor and badly educated nations. And getting that message across, that you can actually do really well, even with the most disadvantaged children, is, I think, one of the most powerful lessons that we can. And this is reflected in student self-beliefs. You have all of those kids here have the same mindset as children here. They believe in their future. They believe that education is going to change their future. I want to show you something that drills in more detail in this. Here I have student performance, and here I have social background, and now I can, and this is Brazil, I can map every school into this diagram. Now the bigger dots are the bigger schools, the smaller dots are the smaller schools, and so on. So what you see here is that actually school performance is a function of social background. The more privileged you are, the higher the dot, the better the school does. You can also see nicely the green dots are the private schools, the white dots are the public schools, how actually the rich families have all bought themselves out of the system. So what do you conclude from this? Some people say it's all about poverty. But then, you focus in on schools that have a very similar socioeconomic context, and you can see how hugely their performance varies. And you actually move that up, you can actually see that here, even among the privileged households, school performance can vary a lot. Or you look at this the other way around, you can actually see, these are all schools with similar learning outcomes, and they come from very, very different kind of social contexts. What this actually tells you, how much better could Brazil do if it would only raise each school to the level of performance of its best statistical neighbor. Brazil could be doing as well as an OECD country today, not by making poorer school students richer, but by actually leveraging up this performance. Keep in mind the picture of Brazil. I want to put in something now, which is Vietnam. This is Brazil, and this is Vietnam. What you see here actually is that the social context of schools in Vietnam is almost identical to the schools in Brazil. But every school does a lot better. You go back to Brazil, now you can see the cloud sinks. It doesn't move leftwards or rightwards. Again, and this tells you actually there's a lot we can gain from cross-national comparisons. Brazil could learn a lot from Brazil. Now you see how these thoughts vary, but Brazil could also learn a lot from Vietnam, and that's where the factor of peer learning here comes really in. I don't want to talk too much about instructional system. That's obviously a very, very important part and something that public policy can get right very quickly. That's why I put it very much to the right side. Creating strong instructional systems is pretty much something that we know how to do and that we could do a lot better than we currently do in many countries. This is the harder part. I put it very much to the left. How do you actually build capacity? This is about teacher development, teacher training, and so on. And there are sort of several dimensions that are really important. First of all is getting the right people into the profession. And again, Brazil, Korea, Israel, UK are countries that have done that really quite well. It's about training them, providing the right kind of training. It's about accompanying them. In fact, people overestimate that impact, underestimate that. China is a great example. China doesn't, some people believe in this myth, and I never know who created this. The top performing education systems attract the teacher from the top third of the graduate distribution. People keep saying this. There's no empirical evidence to support it. In fact, that's true for some top-performing systems. Maybe Singapore or maybe Finland. But if you go to China, you don't find that. It's pretty much the average person who goes into teaching. But they are very, very good in investing the people who are there. And then finally, of course, keeping them in the profession. Getting those four things right puts you on a pretty good path. But it's easy to say, really hard to do. This capacity development, there are no short-term fixes to that. Incentive structures and accountability, easy to do, maybe not that important in the immediate term, but I want to show you a couple of data points on that, actually. The first thing is, there's been a lot of emphasis on, private education, private schooling. And on average, across countries, private schools do better than public schools, almost anywhere. Not true, in Chinese Taipei, Hong Kong, because there, the first choice is always the public school. If you don't get in a good public school, you send your child to a private school. But, once you account for social background, that advantage is actually lost entirely. We cannot measure any performance differences between public and private schools after netting out the social context. And in fact, some countries are really interesting. I think I've highlighted them here. If you look, for example, to Vietnam and Switzerland, the blue dot is a lot higher. The public schools, net of the social background factor, actually outperforming the private schools by a large margin. But so, if it's not that, what is it? School autonomy is part of the story. Here I measure the performance of countries, here the level of school autonomy, and you can see there is a weak but positive relationship. But there are also plenty of exceptions to this. The UK is a great example, the country which already gives its school most autonomy. But there's something else that you need to factor in, and that is the accountability system. One way to measure accountability is actually, do you have a standardized, a shared understanding of what good math teaching is? Now, does the system succeed to give every teacher, every school a message about, what good teaching is? No? Where you do not have that, as reported by schools, you actually see that school autonomy works against you. The more autonomous schools actually perform worse in that system. When you do have this kind of shared notion, it turns the other way around. School autonomy becomes a predictor. And that shows you really it's the combination of accountability and autonomy that seems to be the key to success. The more responsibility you devolve to the front line, the more strengths you need in the overall system. Another dimension of the same thing is, this is very controversial in many countries, though not the UK, is whether you should publish school data. No? And actually what you can see, if you're in a system that is not transparent, no? There's very little shared data on this, you can again see that school autonomy works against you. If you move to a system where actually there's a high degree of transparency in the system, school autonomy becomes your friend. This again, it shows you, I have many more of those charts, I'm going to skip them here, but it shows you that we need to think about many of the policy levers in combination rather than in isolation. I want to actually conclude with some data on how do we invest resources. Two lessons that we have learned is that high-performing education systems are very good in aligning resources with the challenge. They attract the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms. And they're very good in making effective spending choices that prioritize the high quality of teaching. And then some, some of the things those countries do are actually not rocket science. I've always been intrigued how, Shanghai has been able to dramatically reduce between school variation in their performance. And then when you ask them, so what did you actually do? Simple things. They structured their careers around addressing challenges. If you are a principal in a high-performing school, a vice principal in a high-performing school, and you want to become a principal, the education system tells you, wonderful idea, but first help us turn around a low-performing school. London challenge in big. Similar for a teacher. Every teacher career is basically modeled around simple careers possible. The way you become famous in Shanghai as a teacher is very simple. There's a common platform where teachers can upload their lesson plans. And your prestige in the teaching profession depends on how many other teachers actually use your lessons, improve on them, comment on them, and so on. So basically there is an incentive of people to contribute to the profession. And that's really what this is about, making sure that the system devotes most of resources to where they are needed. One thing that you can see is when you look at just volume of spending, if you spend more than $50,000 on the school life of a child, you actually see no relationship with outcomes. The line is absolutely flat. For countries with less money, it's less obvious. You can actually see that, in this part, when you have actually spent very, very little money per student, up to the age of 15-year-olds, money matters more. But even here, look at Tunisia and Vietnam. They spend both very little, but achieve very different results. So money is more of a there's more reasoning for putting more money into education in this part, but even there, spending choices matter a lot. We have also measured equity in spending. This axis here, the vertical axis is performance as usual, but here I don't measure the volume of spending, but I measure how well the spending is aligned with the challenges. Does the money arrive in schools in greater disadvantage? And also the quality of teachers. And actually what you see is that in a few countries, you can say, Finland is a great example, number one here, they actually make a deliberate effort to put more resources, and also the better resources, into schools with greater need. For the majority of countries, it goes the other way around. Even some very wealthy countries, you can look at the United States here, or Australia, New Zealand, they're pretty much to the inequitable line. That is, the more wealthy your schooling context, the more likely you are to get the better teachers and more teachers. What is interesting is, you look at this across countries, and you can see equitable spending is not only a predictor for more equitable outcomes. That's what you expect. You invest more in disadvantaged children, you get better outcomes. But you can see there's even a positive overall relationship with performance. That is, more equitable investment also gets you better outcomes. That means more equitable investment is also more efficient investment. I think a very important part of the story. Just sort of final word, as I said, I showed you that map at the beginning with all these white spots, but some of the white spots are actually now being filled with the help of DFID and other development ministries to actually work on the development of assessment systems for the context of these countries. Some tough challenges for us. You know, in many of those countries, many of the 15-year-olds are no longer in school. So we actually have to complement our school-based assessment with a population-based assessment. And that's actually very, very tricky to do. We have done that for the adult population, we know how to do it, but actually finding those people, getting them to actually sit a test is far from trivial. Second challenge is we have to adapt the measurement instruments. Now, the metric. We started out with the idea of developing an entirely new metric, but these countries actually opposed that very quickly. They said, we don't want a PISA for dummies. We want actually to be in a metric that is comparable to the rest of the world. So, which has been a challenge for us, but we're working on that. And the last part is capturing the context in those countries is a very, very different challenge from what we know. You know, if the schooling, in most of the green countries, we take the infrastructure of schooling for granted, so we don't need to measure it. In some of those countries here, that is a big part of the story. So we actually have to develop and devise new instruments to look into those factors. Well, that's all I wanted to really share with you. I look forward to discussing this.
Thank you, Andreas. That was excellent. I'll look